right. Good afternoon and welcome to this symposium on intersections of mental health and identity. I'm so very glad to have you all here. I'd like to begin by recognizing the sacredness of the land on which our indigenous peoples have lived and this place, and to take just a moment to pay tribute to the sacrifices that they made to allow us to be here in this place today. This symposium on intersections of mental health and identity is a partnership between the Mental Health Symposium Series and the Diversity Symposium Series here at NAU, and is being hosted by the Commission on Disability Access and Design with support from the Office of the President and the Office of the Provost, and with special thanks to the Institute for Human Development and John McDermott, who are allowing this session to be broadcast live to our online audience. Thanks to everybody for your contributions. We very much appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation about the experiences of mental health issues that people from diverse backgrounds and intersectional identities experience. And the panelists that we have here today to discuss those issues and impacts, I think will bring a fruitful conversation to all of us. We will begin with the panel, and then we will have time for questions and answers, and hopefully have a moment to process some of the information shared today for our own personal spheres of influence and spheres of practice. My name is Chris Lanterman. I'm a former co-chair of the Commission on Disability Access and Design and an assistant professor in special education in the College of Education. And I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists, our discussants. First, Leela Monahan from the Department of Anthropology, Jamie Axelrod from Disability Resources, Daryl Joseph from the Department of Educational Specialties, and Chris Margison from Counseling Services here at NAU. We will begin with, as I said, a brief presentation by each of the panelists around some common and cross-cutting themes related to our topic, and hopefully inspire some conversation among the panel. And then again, as I said, we will move into a question and answer period. So again, thank you all for being here. And I'm gonna pass the mic, unless there's a mic over here already.
We've got a mic.
All right, to Leela. Thank you.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here. My name is Leela Monahan, and I teach in the Department of Anthropology. I'm really honored to be invited to speak today. In terms of my own kind of history with mental health, I have had series of, I've had, some experience with depression, but mostly I have been through my life an ally of people with mental health issues. From high school, when my friends were experiencing mental health issues, through college, and now as a teacher, and particularly since I teach large classes. I have 300 to 400 students a term, most terms. And when you have a population that large, you will have people who are having mental health issues. And I feel like I have the duty to care and to try to help people as much as I can. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor, but I am somebody who can listen to people and see if I can help them sort of walk through what's happening. And I've had to do that a number of times this term. I've had to do it a number of times last term. So when Chris invited me to come here, I thought, I know the perfect person to invite to come talk about this. And she said, I don't feel comfortable in talking in front of an audience. I have classes. And I think that that is very typical of people with mental health issues. It's that people have busy lives, and that mental health issues are kind of a complicating factor in already complicated lives. But being an anthropologist, I did what all anthropologists do, and I had a kind of interview conversation with her. So one of the things I'd like to do today is just read some of this conversation with the person I'm going to call Sarah. And I think that will give you an idea of how somebody faces mental health issues and a really complicated life at the same time. I think we should never separate out mental health as something separate, that it is always going with other issues. It's always going with other identities, even though in this interview, it comes out quite clearly that one of the ways that Sarah identifies herself is not somebody with mental health issues. So I think that's one of the complexities that we can talk about afterwards. So let me just start just sort of going through some of this interview. So when I asked her, can you share some thoughts on how you see mental health issues as shaping identity? Her response was, what does this mean? I am female, I am Native American, I'm a parent, I'm mental health issues. I don't think mental health can be an identity. I have ADHD, but I just barely found out. I didn't know I had ADHD my whole life. If I had known, perhaps the medication would have helped me be more successful. I wasn't evaluated until my own son's ADHD difficulties came to light through school. I do think, though, that having ADHD set me apart from my Native peers. I don't know other Navajo with ADHD. When I asked her about the title of the symposium, she said, the title sucks. I don't like the word intersection because it sounds like it's only temporary. To me, mental health issues last a lifetime. And when I asked her about stigma, she said, when my son was diagnosed, I was told by family members that I shouldn't be giving him medication, that it was a behavioral rather than a chemical imbalance. I was told that I would stunt his growth, that I would get him addicted, and that the side effects would hurt him. By the time I was diagnosed, I was able to rethink my thoughts about medication, and I related to him more easily. The first time I took my ADHD medicine, I witnessed my younger son and realized how his behaviors, always moving, always off topic, were a reflection of how I was. Before, I always thought it was normal to lose things, to forget important appointments, to struggle to express myself both verbally and in writing. And then she asked the question, and does mental health include learning disabilities? Because ADHD makes me feel like I have a learning disability. My thoughts go by so fast, I have trouble remembering them to write them down. When she was asked about alternative support services, she replied, what would have helped my son would have been the public school supporting his ADHD behaviors instead of blaming him and myself. Even with the IEP, they were really inconsistent with his accommodations. When I would suggest something like letting him leave to go to a safe, quiet place, they would not try. For me, if I had known that I myself had ADHD and had gotten supported in accommodations when I was young, it wouldn't have been so hard for me. It would have helped to know how to contact programs available to me. When I take the medicine, I cannot tell if it is helping or not, but I find that it seems to be making things easier. And then she also talked about attitudes within our own community. When I talked to a Navajo elder about my racing thoughts, he said I need a ceremony for my racing heart. And when I asked her what would be helpful, what would help is people understanding that mental health issues are not a choice. A person with mental health issues is not going to get attention or is not doing it to get attention or sympathy or to avoid activities. My sons have trouble with teachers who think they are refusing to do work. For me, repeated difficulties lower my self-esteem. I just feel lucky that I have teachers, the teachers I have now, who are supportive, and that I have a small cohort. If I'd been a large cohort, I would have failed. I hate matching socks. Takes me forever. Finally, though, we just bought socks that are all the same. Other issues I have are going off topic, having random thoughts, and being impulsive. I also sometimes forget to take my medication. I feel like I have 4 pots in the stove, and I'm trying to keep them from burning. But I don't go around saying that we are a family with ADHD. And I wish she had been here to sort of say that in her own words, because it sounds even more powerful when she's saying it. But I think the lessons that we can draw from it is Sarah is a woman with a very complex life. She's a mother of 4. She's a full-time student. She's trying to juggle all these different demands. In the last year, 3 close relatives of hers have died. So grief adds to sort of typical stresses from having ADHD. And when I step back and look at her as having problems typical of many of my students, I can see that so many of my students are stressed. My students experience loss of family. My students have experienced domestic violence. I have students who have been suicidal. And how can we set up an environment where people are recognized for their strengths, people are recognized for the insights they bring, and not put into the sort of boxes that people are being forced into? One of my students came to me and said, my counselors told me to take 7 courses last term, and I failed a lot of them. It's like, why is anybody being given 7 classes? That's ridiculous. I was, when I sort of like started thinking about it afterwards, why are our students being forced to take 5 classes a term 4 years in a row? It's exhausting. I tried calling student psychological services this morning, and it's sort of like, when I was reading, it's like, hi, can't guarantee you appointment, it's probably a couple months out. It's like, we have students in crisis. Why is it such a long time for students to get the help they need? For me, thinking about mental health is not only thinking about the individuals. I'm not a psychologist. I don't start from the individual. I'm an anthropologist. I start from the context. And I can see that the context, both nationally, and that students are stressed out and depressed nationally, but also at NAU, that students are stressed out. And is there a way that we could put more air into the program to let our students just breathe a little more and have time to deal with these issues in the way that they do not seem to now?
Thank you. So my name's Jamie Axelrod. I'm the director of the Disability Resources Office and the ADA coordinator for campus. I'm also the current co-chair for the Commission on Disability Access and Design, or one of the co-chairs. I have a colleague, Dorianne Pollock, who helps with that. And I think what I'd like to do is build a little bit on that, on what Leela just described in terms of the environment and the environments that we create. And so I really, in thinking about this talk and this presentation, wanted to come at this more from my role as the co-chair of the Commission on Disability Access and Design. Because an important feature for the commission, as one of the president's diversity commissions, is to recognize that disability, which includes mental health disabilities, is an aspect of the diversity of this campus. Right? The title about intersections of identity has a lot of context to it, and oftentimes we have very specific ways that we think about identity. And I think people are paying more and more closer attention to identity for themselves, for others in the community, as they engage with one another and what's happening around campus. And I think the interest in that is about learning more and knowing more about your community members and your peers. I often find it interesting that many people will approach us at the Disability Resources Office or at the Commission with a limited understanding that mental health conditions might qualify as a disability. Right? They have a notion of what the Americans with Disabilities Act might cover, or what that might look like. People are actually much more aware that that might include invisible disabilities like learning disabilities, something that was mentioned earlier. But people are often surprised to find out that that includes mental health conditions that could rise to the level of a disability. And I mention that mental health conditions that could rise to the level of a disability because for all of us, just like our physical health status changes maybe on a daily or weekly basis, our mental health status can be changing on a regular basis as well, right? We all experience different aspects of our physical and mental well-being. So I think it's important to recognize that many members of our community are individuals with mental health conditions or mental health disabilities. I would tell you that at this point in time, about 25% of the students that we work with at the Disability Resources Office indicate that their primary condition is a mental health condition. But beyond that, students with other types of primary disabilities also indicate that at the same time, they have some mental health conditions or disabilities that are a part of their primary condition or add a level of complexity, right, in terms of what they experience on campus and their engagement in the academic environment, in the social environment, in the physical environment around campus. So that's a good number of students. And the Disability Resources Office also provides support and accommodation for employees with disabilities. And so, we're aware that not only are students with mental health disabilities part of our community, but employees with mental health disabilities are part of our community as well. And as such, they bring a particular perspective to the community, many things to share about how they engage with and participate in all of the different types of programs, educational opportunities, employment opportunities that happen on campus. So they bring not only, their perspective as a student or employee, but their perspectives as individuals with disabilities and mental health disabilities specifically to the campus community, and more importantly, those environments that we create on campus. And that's where I think, from the position of disability access and design, right? That's part of our title is design, is how do we look at how we've designed this environment? How do we look at the way we have designed what in essence becomes a piece of our culture on this campus and in our community? We all know that academic or even work environments are designed to have a level of rigor, are designed to challenge us in some ways, are designed to push us in certain types of ways, because it's about growth and learning. And that in and of itself is a challenging environment, and people opt into that challenging environment. But what types of additional barriers have we created just in the way we've designed the environment? I think, Leela brought up a great one. time and space to breathe, and the cognitive energy that it takes to be involved in 4 or 5, or maybe for some students, 7 classes in which every day they're taking in and assimilating new knowledge. Not knowledge that they brought with them that they're then implementing in a program, but most of the time new knowledge that they're needing to process, right, and utilize in new ways. And not only are they doing that in one area, but they might be doing that in 5 or 6 areas. That takes a lot of energy, and that's part of the rigor. That's part of the challenge. So, knowing that just that activity is challenging, what are some barriers that we've built into our systems that aren't necessary to that educational purpose? Right? Have we looked around to take a look at what barriers have we created just in our systems or in our organization that may unnecessarily add to the complexities of a life that's already fairly complex? I think a great example coming from the commission is that we have a really nice relationship with our facility services folks, right? So that we are engaged in reviewing and taking a look at all of the physical spaces that we create on campus with an eye to not just complying with what we're required to do, but also making those spaces usable for as many people as possible, right? Removing barriers or ensuring that as we create those environments, that we don't erect unnecessary barriers. And we've got a great partnership to do that. But how do we do that in the other spaces that we create on campus? How do we do that in the curricular environment? How do we do that in the social environment? Do we have a way in which we can look at the types of challenges we want to create for people, because that's the educational mission, right? That's the growth, but also be able to identify either the unintended barriers or the unnecessary barriers. And we want to create an environment that has that level of challenge, but doesn't have to add extra unnecessary challenge, not just for that student or employee that might have a mental health disability, but for all of us that are navigating that community and that environment. So what does that look like? How do we each take some responsibility for the pieces that we build into this community to say, how do I take into consideration all the types of learners, all the types of guests, all the types of employees that come to these programs? And can I design with each one of those people in mind? Now, that's a lot of people, and we all know that you meet one person with a mental health disorder or disability, you've met one person with a mental health disability, right? It's not everybody is going to have the same types of experiences. So it might be hard to create environments that can take into account every single aspect of the complex lives and experiences. But how do we consider in general solving for most of those, right? Can we build in more flexibility into our programs, into our curriculum, into our services, whatever those environments are? How do we look at what students and community members are bringing to the table to say, do things have to be a very particular type of way, or are there multiple ways for individuals to achieve certain ends, to demonstrate their skills, to demonstrate their learning, to engage with the content? And I think that we have a long way to go in looking at how we design those environments with different individuals and the complexities of their lives in mind. Because after all, our educational mission is to, right, educate students in a progression to graduation and to see an achievement and an attainment that we know they're capable uh, of achieving. So what's our part in meeting that student where they are, or that community member where they are, and making that opportunity available, right? Recognizing it's a two-way street, but how do we, it's a complex balance of equities. How do we challenge folks to the level that we know they're growing and learning in the way we hope they will, but also balancing the unique aspects of their identities and their complex lives at the same time. So I know we're going to, at the end, sort of present some questions for folks to consider. And I would be really interested in hearing from all of you. Where do you see unnecessary barriers? Not necessarily physical ones, but those ones that might have interactions with individuals who have mental health conditions or mental health disabilities. And what are the types of things you see we might be able to do to address those? Right? How can we make some potential systemic change that might provide people greater flexibility, greater opportunity, but still maintain the mission of the institution, right? It's a complex kind of thing. And I think, going back to sort of my role at Disability Resources, maybe many years ago, we solved some of the problems for how do we make sure students who have difficulty accessing print, right, can get their materials in a way they can perceive. How can we get access for communication to folks who are deaf or hard of hearing? How do we address the needs of students with learning disabilities who might take them longer to retrieve information and provide it in an exam setting? We've solved a lot of those issues, but I think as we see more and more individuals with mental health conditions coming to campus, which I think is a great thing, we want to see that. We know that's a part of our community, and we want them to add to that diversity and that conversation. But I think some of the barriers they face are unique and different from those ones we've already solved for. So our next mission is looking at how do we address those needs? How do we address that access? How do we remove those barriers through both maybe individual interaction, but also through systemic investigation and change? I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Jamie. Loloma nu person pi an matsewa pe na mungkanga pe na iswangwa na highlight ma yet sosoyum sabaltoti. My name is Daryl Joseph. That's my English name. My Hopi name is Pahusumpi. I'm from the village of Munkapi on the Hopi Reservation, and I represent the Coyote clan. For those of you who may not be familiar, the Hopi Reservation is about an hour's drive northeast of Flagstaff, Arizona. And we want to start our presentation out with it's a two-part presentation. So there's Dr. Margison and I that will be sharing our shared experiences of working in a high school setting on the Hopi Reservation and looking at the transition of students into post-secondary settings and trying to analyze the framework of how mental health has framed itself through programming and looking at aspects of resilience and asset-based planning for really the support and contribution of allowing our American Indian students to bolster their indigenous identities. And what does that mean when we're talking about the intersection of identity with disability as it pertains to mental health? So I am an assistant professor at the College of Education and Ed Specialties. I'm also affiliated with the Institute for Human Development, which is just an amazing program. If you don't know about IHD, please look it up. There's some great colleagues here who are representing the department. But I want to start with a story which really is about my experience of becoming an educator and understanding what that meant to me in relation to where I came from. As we think about mental health, we know that it impacts all of us, and that we don't address mental health issues in isolation. That as we learned, there are various environmental considerations that are unique to all of us. And so, in my story, in terms of the experience of me becoming an educator, I had grew up on the reservation of Hopi and graduated and came here to NAU to complete my undergrad and master's. But through that process, becoming an educator, I had believed I'd done a very good job of learning how to be a great special education teacher. And that I was meeting the goal and value of my home community, of their expression of awtu kayet pu'amusinam amungam lavaiwasni, a common phrase that I think is said to pretty much all of us as we're transitioning through adolescence and thinking about what we want to aspire to be. And that interprets as, go and get your education, and once you do, come back and help your people. So in this process of becoming an educator, I returned home and worked in the school systems. And in that process, what I was doing very well, and I was very proud of saying that I did very well, was being a qualified special ed teacher using the best practices of special ed. And through this process, implementing strategies and interventions and using methods of identification to categorize and label students with specific categories of disability. And as I became more involved with my community, I had two experiences that really shed light on my lack of orientation and awareness of my own positionality as not only an educator, but a Hopi educator. What does that mean in terms of the intersex of coming from a community with culture and language, with the overlap of a cultural model of an academic environment, being an educator. In my initial experience, I overlooked a lot of the assets of my community by limiting the amount of integration or development of universal design for learning to help my students use their own funds of knowledge of being Hopi community members and contributing to their learning. So when I went to high school, which is where I met Dr. Margison, who also served as our special education counselor, and I served as the special education director. I think we had a very wonderful process or system set up for our youth who were graduating from our school from special education as well. And I kind of phrase it as having, various plans, plan A, B, and C. We did an amazing job with identifying partners outside of the reservation, partners within the reservation, to expose our students to experiences of employment, independent living, and higher education. And so through this process of transition, when families would come in and meet with us, it was frequent that we would also have grandparents who were the caretakers of their grandchildren. And when you think about the intersex of mental health around these ecological conditions that exist, situations such as, not having the primary parents available was a really big factor impacting the mental health of our students. So we had a grandmother come in, and we'd go through the end of the year, suggesting plan A, B, or C. If students want to stay in the community and find employment there, that was an option. If students want to leave the reservation and then move into an urban setting, that was an option. So we presented these ideas, and a grandmother who was very vocal, and the granddaughter who was not as vocal came into the office during a meeting, and we presented the transition plans. And she turned to me and she said, "Mr. Joseph, we don't want to choose any of those plans." And she followed that by saying, "We want our granddaughter to be the firekeeper of our village home." And that put me in my place. I'm like, wow, I've been working here in my own community for a number of years now, and I'm still neglecting to identify the value of the intersections of culture and language with, the identity components of the students that we serve. And to understand that being a firekeeper in a cultural context was equivocal to independent living, employment, and higher education in a Western context, because they were learning more about the traditional knowledge of our culture. They were getting that higher education that is a form of employment based in a cultural system. And so through that process, we as a program had to reevaluate how we were utilizing the assets of our students in contributing to their plans for transition. What did that look like for them? And then, looking at these ideas of challenging the system to say, it's not the traditional model of these post-secondary outcomes that we're going to report. We're going to report it as it relates to our cultural identities and the environment that we work within. And so I think that brings to mind very important points about the intersections of identity as it relates to culture, as it relates to language, but also as it relates to mental health. Because as we know, and I think as we've heard in the previous two speakers, that mental health is an experience that we are not immune to. All of us have experiences with that. And for our students, looking at an asset-based model that would improve their self-advocacy, that would improve their self-esteem, so that when they're making decisions about transition, they take all of who they are into these other environments that they're required to be more independent in. And so when we relate that here to the university, in the context of our students, that's what our students are doing. They're leaving a primary home community that was provided some comfort. But as we transition between those spaces to a secondary home environment, then we're engaged with having to negotiate and navigate cultural models of what we've learned to new cultural models that we're engaging with. And so within that experience, we learned a lot and developed a plan that we want to share with you. You can go to the this slide here actually was what Chris did for us, the acknowledgement of land, the San Francisco peaks. So I just want to recognize that again, but I'm going to pass it over to Chris so he can do the follow-up of our story.
All right, thank you, Daryl. So a lot of what we went through was looking at identity pieces from being educators at the high school and trying to provide for individuals that were identified within the school system as having identity for special education, having learning difficulties, or some mental health component that was impairing their ability to function in a regular ed classroom. And so we spent a lot of time just talking, after hours, in between, 5 minutes here and there, of like, what can we do different? The system wasn't working, and we were also part of that system. And we had seen these individuals experiencing a lot of difficulty with their own identity, with being Native, being in special education. So there's a bunch of different layers on that. And then wanting to go out and after high school and attain their goals. And so we looked at, well, what can we do? And so we spent a lot of time talking, and we had to fall back on the culture and say, what is the strengths from the culture that we can draw upon of these individuals in order to help all of us meet the goals that we are all agree on, not just what we think being in the department but also from what the, the grandmother, what Zoe wanted for her daughter, and what does that look like? And so we developed kind of a more kind of a visual representation of what does it look like to identify your steps outside of the high school. And so we had created kind of a few different tracks, and then we put it to the students and going, what does that look like for you all after high school? And all the options on the table, not just, higher ed, but cultural. What is it, in your village? What is within your clanship? And also some of the negative consequences as well, because we didn't want to look at just what is the good things we wanted, but what are some of the negative consequences that may happen without being more active and being advocating for yourself. And so this is just a picture of what we did. And we had the students come in after school or even on the weekends to make a visual representation using some of the cultural components that they were familiar with and applying it to their own identity and their own issues that they're struggling with, and also what they want to do when they get out, when they graduate high school. And so you can see some of them can be, there's a car there looking at different pathways that they want to identify with. And so we had to get buy-in from them in order to incorporate what we all felt, them, the students, as well as the educators, us loosely. And it really went well. We noticed a big change in our program when we would come in on the weekends and they would work on painting this mural. And also another component of it was we couldn't just keep this in the classroom. We had to go outside of the high school, which meant we had to go to different villages, and we also had to come out to Flagstaff and to come out to other businesses to expose them to what is going on here. This is also a different component. It isn't just a lecture-based learning. It had to be experiential. And so we had to, fight with our admin and try to get money and try to say to the system, this isn't working for our students. We have to do something different. They're struggling as it is, and we can't just talk. We have to get out there. And so we, thanks to Daryl, we did some fighting and we won. And so we were able to get out there and to have them experience. And from a cultural perspective, they had to see others that were similar to them, be it in skin tone, be it in, generation, that are out there off of the res, working or in school or doing a trade, and had to be paired up with them. And so we essentially did kind of a partnership and an apprenticeship where we go out and have them spend a day or a couple of days with outside individuals or agencies, kind of cutting their teeth on what it's like to be out there, not just listening to myself or Daryl just talk to them. And so that was another aspect that we had to incorporate. And then also just spending a lot of time talking about, what does it mean to be in special education? What does it mean to have this diagnosis? And a lot of times, like, I don't really know. And so having to take, kind of the stigma that's associated with mental illness or a learning disability, and, as Dr. Brene Brown talks about, being vulnerable and bring it to the light. When we bring things to the light that we have, that we identify with, it takes some of that negativity away from it. And so we would spend a lot of time just talking about, what does it mean to have a specific learning disability in reading? Why do you have that? Or to have ADHD, what does that look like in your life, in your culture, within your family context? And so spending a lot of time just working on their own identity and having them learn to be an advocate for themselves and to learn about how their identity is fluid, it's dynamic. In school, they may be diagnosed with a reading disorder or dyslexia, but when they go to the village, that doesn't exist. That identity may not be carrying with them there. And so just talking to them about, yes, and in one capacity, Western ways say you have this disorder, but that doesn't mean it has to stick with you everywhere you go. You can change, you can modify, you can look at other parts of your identity and take that as a strength in a different context. And so just having those conversations about how your identity is fluid. It can change depending on the context in which you're in, and using that from a strengths-based to formulate who you want to be and who you are now. And also that your identity with this disability does not encapsulate who you are. It may follow you, whether you want it to or not in some capacity, but it doesn't ultimately define, and it isn't the overall arching defining characteristic of who your identity is. And so that was another thing that we did. If you can go to the next slide, thank you. And so that talks a little bit about what we had to weave in between the Western and kind of the value system out on Hopi, and working with that and having these conversations about just conceptualizing what identity can look like when you maybe are here at this school or when you're in your village. And then when you go off of the reds, right? We, code switching, things like that. We would talk to these individuals and ourselves, and, we would grow as well. It's not just us teaching, it's us learning. And we would talk about this and have discussions, not far different than what we're going to be doing later on when we open it up to everybody, is taking risks, and talking about, we kind of messed up for a little bit. And we had to see and listen to others in the community show us where do we need to go further. And so just looking at some of the different standards of how we were educated, with how do we apply that in a culturally sensitive way, and also in a way that speaks to their identity, and how do we get them to understand how they identify more in various contexts. Anything else that you wanted to add to that?
I think just highlighting Chris's point about the idea of having to re-examine that, the process of presenting an idea doesn't always work the first time, and it wasn't successful. And we went through that process, such as, the example of the story I just told you. But I think the amazing thing about that was the demonstration and willingness of those situated in the positions of power, the educators, the directors, us, to re-examine and reframe the context within which we're creating pathways for our students. And that's a very important point when we're talking about mental health. I think Jamie referenced it a little bit, in the sense that when we approach things from a very limited point of view or worldview, there are things that we miss, and how do we address that so that we're deconstructing those frameworks and reconstructing this in a new way, so that we're being more inclusive, more aware. And it's so much more important now than ever, considering the diversity of our communities, the diversity of the university, and where all these individuals come from. Everyone in this room has come from some place. You're bringing with you aspects of those home community-based values. We're all engaging in these Western constructs through an academic environment. We're all negotiating these constructs, we're all adapting. And so within that, then we get into some of these statistics and challenges around mental health. If we look at intersecting the role of race and ethnicity in that, we know that Native Americans are the highest disproportionately represented individuals with the highest suicide rates, when we're only 2% of the US population. When we look at special education programs and the representation of students with high incidence disabilities, they're disproportionately represented with Native Americans. With intellectual disabilities and behavior disabilities, African Americans are disproportionately represented. So when we talk and go back to these ideas of systems and how systems are working, or how systems are proposed, reevaluating and deconstructing some of these traditional systems are, I think, some of the things that we've learned through the process of working within our high school. That there were new ways that we had to incorporate this role of diversity within our environment. What are the ecological circumstances, environmental circumstances that affect the decision making as we're planning these programs? And if we ask those questions as it relates to individuals with mental health and intersections of identity, there's still a lot of work to do. You know, there's still a lot of work that we have to do. So if you can go to that next slide. Oh, yes. So for our students, and this actually was the work that we did was a stepping stone for this tool, in the sense that it's called the Nihongbita model, and it's using the term Nihongbita in my language, meaning find your inner strength, have self-empowerment. And so I use that term to really contextualize this idea that all of us have a capital H home environment, right? And those environments provide these cultural resources that help us make decisions, you know, interpret our experiences. As we're transitioning into higher education, we can call that the lowercase h home, where there's an environment introducing various secondary cultural models, so that negotiation and adaptation is happening through that transition. For us, for bolstering the identities of our Native students and youth, you know, we understand that there's a component of history, you know, that includes political, economic, traditional, and contemporary histories. How is that interpreted at an individual level? How is it interpreted at that macro level within systems, you know? And then the community of, you know, that the role of community in that is, what aspect of community does the student bring with them as they're making this transition? What is the responsibility of the communities they're leaving to that individual, and the responsibility of the communities these students are entering? So as we're working on those components of developing self-empowerment for students, we then, I think, address some areas of developing inclusiveness, a sense of place, sense of belonging in an environmental space. And so for our Native American students, that's one thing that we thought was very important, as Chris mentioned, that many of our students had the cultural traits to go anywhere they wanted, you know, and be successful. But knowing how to do that, knowing that they were engaged in systems where weren't traditionally engaged by people like them, teaching them the skills and assets to facilitate as they're entering those contexts was so important. And that's where we did this reevaluation and developed that mural of pathways, you know, choices that they could make. What's the next slide? Okay, so we want to wrap up with learning some of our bullet points.
So part of this experience and that we had, and how this pertains to identity here, is that you have to change some of the stereotypes, and maybe even with yourselves, changing the stereotype of how you identify in certain areas, and challenging that with yourself is what we also had to do with challenging what stereotypes we were taught in school, and learning to do what we did out there. Also, a huge component of what we did with these individuals was just empowerment. You know, they were in a system saying, you're not good at this, so we're going to have to put you here. You're just not good enough. And really, we had to reframe this and talk to them about learning to be an advocate for themselves, to say, you are absolutely good enough. And we're going to talk about how you can work through some of this, how you can work around it, but you need to be aware of that, so that in order you can better identify and not take on the negativity that some labels do have. The second one was, you know, just experiential learning. In the classroom was not sufficient. We had to go out there and have multiple experiences throughout the school year in order to foster and help them develop with their identity. Another aspect was community-based. We had to involve the community in that role. Also greater outside of the community as well, and to form those partnerships and to form those relationships that were really important, but also really drew upon the Hopi and some of the Navajo students that we worked with, is that community is very important and relationships are very important. And so we had to model that in our educational piece as well. And then getting out of the rigid definition of what rural meant, you know, I grew up in what I thought was a rural community of 18,000 people, and living in a village with 350 people, that's rural, right? But also just expanding that definition in order to better understand what that can mean. And then building bridges between cultures and communities, just having that conversation of, here, out on Hopi in your village, this is a value system here. And if we go to Phoenix or to Yavapai, there's a different set of values. And just talking to them about that, and also talking, how do you navigate that with yourself without feeling like you're losing a part of your identity? And having that discussion of identity can be context dependent. You can, heighten or augment some of your values that you already have, and identity values in different contexts, as well as, depending on where you go. And then identity, as I mentioned, can be context dependent and fluid, and also using a systems-based approach to solving problems. Daryl and I knew that we couldn't solve this problem ourselves. We needed the help of our students. We need to understand what were they needing from us. And then we had to utilize our administration and the resources they had in order to really facilitate achievement of our goals.
Thank you.
Sure.
Please let's thank our panelists. We've had wonderful insights and perspectives from their presentations, and in just a second, I would like to invite questions for our panelists. And in respect for the folks who are joining us online, we would like to be sure that you have a microphone in your hand when you ask a question. So please let us know.
I'm happy to bring the mic around to folks, Chris.
Thanks, John. I'd like to just say that the panel as a whole brought up some really important takeaways from my perspective about the issues of mental health and intersectionality. Primarily, to start, I appreciated Sarah's perspective that intersectionality is fluid, dynamic, and potentially temporary. And I think that's a really important point, especially around mental health, that most everybody presented discussed the fact that mental health is something that we all experience in one way or another. Mental health issues, mental health challenges on some level. And so it should not be something that is stigmatized, or that we look down on or hide necessarily. The fact that we do, I think, points to something that everybody also discussed, which are those cultural values, those societal institutional constructs that create a sense of otherness around mental health. And that is something that I believe we can work to deconstruct. And hopefully, as we get through the last part of our session today, that we'll be able to discuss some of the ways in which we might begin to deconstruct those constructs, those stigmas that make it so that mental health has a one-down position in many ways. And the last point that I'd like to make before I open it up to questions is related specifically to special education, because that is Daryl's field and my field, and the idea that the diagnoses and the eligibility criteria for those classifications, those labels, are very arbitrary, and they are very much based on somebody's idea of what constitutes normal and what constitutes abnormal. And I think that that is an underlying issue that we experience in many aspects of what we're talking about, with identity, with ability, with disability, with mental health. And that some group has defined what that means. And I think that's an important takeaway for us as well. So with that, I'd like to invite questions for those who have them. And I'd like to give one more thanks to our panelists before we do that.
Any questions out there? I see a hand. Here I come. Do my Donahue thing. If any of you remember Donahue.
Hi, everybody. Ooh, can you hear me? Oh, good. Wow, this is great. My name is Grace. I have a question about, I guess let me start with context. I had a conversation with a friend of mine last night who is Navajo, and we were discussing the fact that her grandmother had had a fall that day. And my question to her was, oh, does she have some kind of emergency device that she can activate when a fall happens? And she said, well, she doesn't need one because we have family around her all times of the day. So there's always somebody available. So I guess my question in terms of supporting students of a variety of backgrounds who've come to NAU for school is that if they come from a background where there's an expectation of family being present and family being able to support and being the resource when something goes wrong, how can we find better ways to support those students when having family around is not necessarily an option?
Is this on? Now it's on. Okay. It's one of the things I've done since I came here is I've done trainings on at-risk students. And in my experience, at-risk students are people just with complicated lives and who have often family obligations that they will sometimes draw them away. And one of the things that I've done in my own teaching is to give people makeup work. So it's sort of like, I consider attendance very important, but giving people makeup work so that they can do their family obligations, so that they can go home and be with their grandmother if necessary. And then on the flip side, when that student's here at NAU by themselves, I think I've known Sarah for a number of years. She's been a student of mine in a number of different capacities. And that I kind of recognized Sarah as somebody who had a complicated life, who had so much to bring to the classroom. It's like when students were doing a project, she was the one who figured out, oh, okay, the slug garden isn't up and running, so we'll go to the botany garden. And she was the one who sort of found how to do that because she's got incredible kind of community networks that, you know, better community networks than any student I've ever had. And it was just sort of like recognizing Sarah as an individual that I think gave her a relationship with me that we've built on over years. So she invited me to her cousin's funeral a couple of weeks ago. And so we can't be everything, but I think for certain students who have really complicated lives, I think we can be more than just a teacher, that we can be a mentor and a support, and that can give some sort of context for them so that they don't feel quite so alone when they're away from a family. And this is not just my Native American students, it's also students from large extended families and, you know, all sorts of different backgrounds. I think that as an anthropologist, students who come from large families are often incredible resources for having other people understand what does it look like to live in a different kind of family rather than just a plain nuclear family. And so it's both an opportunity, but it's also something that needs work in my idea. Does that help? Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah, I think just, you know, empowering that student to talk to their professor about, look, this is my situation. This is what's going on with me, without having to go to like the level for at Jamie's department to go to disability resources, and then seeing if that professor will have, you know, will respond in kind. If not, go to the chair, talk to the chair. And again, this is part of that identity that is important, that the system will not take into account unless you talk to that system and let them know that this is important to me. This is my part of a huge part of my identity. What are you going to do to meet my needs, kind of thing? And not in this kind of like, oh, you know, kind of, you know, I'm like needs like some, you know, super special things, but just how can you relate to me as a human, and take into consideration without having to go through some systems wide changes. Does that make sense?
So just to follow up on that, I think that's exactly what I want to share is, you know, understanding the human component of day-to-day interactions with one another, and understanding that we all have various contexts as to what we identify as our capital H home communities. You know, some of us come from very nuclear families, and some of us come from families that are very extended and very immediate, you know. And so in that, those processes in this space like a university, I believe that we um, have some work to do in the sense of how we relate to one another as human beings, so that we're not isolating in situations based on context as a teacher, as a professor student relationship, but you know, what are those human aspects of our daily needs? You know, do we recognize that as our students walk into the classroom? Do we ask them about how their family is doing? You know, do we relate and acknowledge one another? I know for many, and this is, and I don't speak for all people who come from the American Indian backgrounds, but for many American Indians, we relate to one another as brothers and sisters. You know, I call Chris my brother, you know, with that acknowledgement that there's more there, in the sense that we share this space. And so, you know, I think there's some context that we have to understand, but also know that, you know, underneath all of that, there's a basic human circumstance that we share. And if we acknowledge that, then you have more of a sense of like, we share this space in common. You know, I don't have to engage in a new space, voiding certain aspects of who I am, right? And I think that's something that is a very challenging circumstance for any student coming to a university, because we're in the culture of academia. Um, but for many of our students, we all come from various families, and so how do we recognize that as individual traits? You know, so and not generalizing that to all a broader population of people.
And I would just add, in terms of, if we do what Daryl's describing, right, we make a lot of progress in terms of the climate of the campus and the diversity of the community. As we do those things and recognize those things in each individual that we can, we bring that human element to be a part of our culture on campus. And hopefully we make that small H home a place that folks feel more comfortable and supported and engaged, and where they can get the resources and understanding and relationship that they're looking for. John, I know there was a question popped up online. Yeah.
It's a question from Tyler. He's asking, in talking about mental health, how do we address, acknowledge the manifestation of mental unwellness or distress students experience that stems from living in a settler society that is still very actively racist, sexist, xenophobic, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, etc., while navigating within a university that doesn't condemn or even neutralize hate speech or acts? How do we support resiliency in a society university that is actively harming many of our students?
I had a student. I teach both undergrads, and I have a couple of grad students. And one of my grad students came to me and said, "Oh my God, they don't realize what they're doing. It's mortifying." She is Navajo, and it's like they don't know basic information. And for me, that started, and you know, this is something I've been thinking about in a number of different contexts, but that we have to have historical teaching in our classrooms, but we also need to be careful. You know, sort of talking to fellow teachers, we need to not traumatize people by the history, but also acknowledge the history so that people don't say, you know, that sort of assumptions don't go unchallenged. And it's probably the biggest, you know, sort of like going along with mental health, but connected to mental health. It's probably the biggest challenge that we as teachers have today. It's how do we acknowledge students' backgrounds? How do we acknowledge the history that we all share but haven't necessarily been taught? And that takes work at a curricular level, that takes work at an institutional level, and that takes sort of making space so that people can feel comfortable, because these are often quite uncomfortable situations for everybody involved.
I'll just add very briefly, and I agree. I think that you know, that's a very loaded question, Tyler, wherever you are. And I don't think there's one true answer to that, other than that there's a lot of work to do, right? And we all need to do it together. And I think that when we analyze aspects of history, the relationship of shared history between all of us as human beings, there are very traumatic experiences in our history that we have to acknowledge. And until we can acknowledge that history, it will continue to be difficult. We'll continue to have these conversations of the lack of inclusion, you know, the lack of acceptance, you know, creating sense of belonging in various environments. And that's why we put that up on that Nahongvita model, is that, you know, there's a community context to it. And to build empowerment for any one individual, there's a relationship between history and the communities they come from and the communities we're going into. And as we're doing that, we're developing new communities. And so it may not happen immediately, but I think that's part of the work that we're required to do as we're asking these questions is, what am I doing to change that? You know, it may not be a big major change that you want, but in subtle, small ways, it's occurring. I think we had a conversation in coming up with this presentation today that, you know, we're just now addressing these concepts of intersectionality and identity in spaces like this. And it's a context that has been occurring for a long time now, but we're now creating the space to have these conversations. Well, our generations, younger generations of people, our youth, have, that's part of their culture. That's part of their cultural models. These are things that they're already aware of. And so when you think about generation gaps, the youth are ready to talk about it. It's the generations before that are still creating that awareness, still creating that acceptance, still creating an ability to acknowledge it. And so when you're asking that question, I think the larger question is, from what context are you asking that question, and what are you doing in your own space to create that change? So that's what I'd say.
Jamie, do you have any?
Yeah, and I'd like to just, again, acknowledge what Daryl said in terms of, I think there is work, there's a lot of work to be done in this space, but we're starting to create that space. And I think acknowledging all the folks around the campus community that are engaged in that activity, and when that space is created, come and join, come and participate, bring your individual piece and perspective so that we can have better conversations and better acknowledgement, but also create that change within our community. And I think we need to incentivize both student and employee participation in those processes and in creating those spaces and in engaging in those conversations and opportunities to address those issues and make change.
Yeah, and I think part of that change is, having these conversations that are difficult, being okay with being discomforted, and bringing something up like that question had is, pretty strong question. And to have this conversation against some powers that be, it may be very difficult. But I think we have to do that. And we also have to be able to be in a space where we feel anxiety or maybe we feel a little nervousness, and to still try to listen to that other individual and truly understand their perspective, and not trying to argue, not trying to say, well, this is why, but just hearing the other voices that are out there, I think is, again, part of that conversation from wherever your perspective is, and being okay with feeling anxious or having that discomfort. It's going to be a part of this conversation when we're talking about such powerful forces that are in existence. What other questions, comments? These are great.
I just want to say, Tyler says thank you to the panel. You guys didn't see a pop up there. And if I could add just one more thing, vote. That's it. Just go register, go make your voice known, and cast the vote. That's the necessary thing.
Hi. Thank you all for the panel and the conversation. My name is Gerald Wood. I'm in the College of Ed. And I want to think about some of the, in a lot of ways, right, when we think about disability, when we think about mental health, right, as mentioned conversations, right, around race, ethnicity, it becomes atomized, right, to an individual level. And we look for individual solutions. And I think the law requires some kind of, right? So I'm thinking about how do we, I want to say that the stigma about talking about mental health is less, but I'm not sure of that, right? But I'm wondering, what can we do in our classrooms, in the environments that we're in, to actually create communities that allow for these conversations to happen so people can actually be fully who they are with the many identities that they bring into the space? And is that part of the conversation, and how do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was something that I addressed earlier, I think that is a place that we really struggle, because when we atomize it to an individual person, we're going to take a particular action for a particular person. Right, that it's nice that we've helped that individual, but what are we doing in greater context? Because there are other individuals that are probably having similar experiences. So as we design classroom environments, social environments, how do we consider what the barriers that those environments can create for folks with mental health disabilities or mental health conditions, and build some flexibility in from the start, right? How do we look at the activities that are happening in our class? Do we design activities specifically to foster that conversation and openness, but maybe conversations on the broader level that we were just talking about? How do we recognize that human element in each of the aspects of those curricular activities, or deadlines, or the way we assess individuals, right? How do we have a awareness of who all the learners in those spaces are going to be, and say, my ultimate goal, our ultimate mission is to educate individuals. And I reckon, how do we put in place different ways for people to be able to demonstrate that they've engaged with the content, learned it, mastered it, and then can show that back? I think that's a challenge. And I think it takes a lot of consideration, and probably opportunities for us all to come together to learn more about what we don't know, right? What are those things? What's that basic information we don't have? So that as we're creating those processes and those environments and spaces, we're doing that with all the people who might come to those spaces in mind. Are we going to be able to are we going to be able to address this particular needs of every individual student? Probably not. But if we can solve for 80%, right, of what folks coming to that space are going to need in terms of learning and expressing and socializing and engaging, and we've got a long way, and we still have some other tools at our disposal to capture and address that last 20%. But I also think it demonstrates that we're considering everyone in the community, and I think that fosters a campus climate that people can connect to and recognize that, yes, in general, I can have what I need. Well, I'm not experiencing lots of unnecessary barriers that don't seem essential to what I'm doing here or the mission of the institution itself.
So when I got here about 4 years ago, and hi, you're here. Okay, start teaching. This is the textbook that we've just chosen, or and it was a colleague of mine. She said, this is the best textbook I found. Started teaching with it. But one of the things I found that it didn't address is the relationship between the individual and society, and also within anthropology, the field of psychological anthropology. And I ended up putting in a week on psychological anthropology in week 3. And the article that I use is by Tanya Lerman and colleagues that talks about how American voices, if for people with psychosis, are really vicious and nasty and tell them terrible things. Whereas internationally, voices are being read as being more supportive. They're family members that are giving them advice. They're not these sort of vicious American voices. And I love that article because it puts psychological issues as cultural issues. It's not just saying, hi, this person's abnormal. It's we are all in this larger context. And the attitudes we have towards mental health issues affects. And it also gives a way for students to have a kind of safe space to talk about these issues in a sort of fairly quickly. So I think putting kind of materials about mental health into curriculums gives students spaces to talk about it. So it's not, hi, this is a mental health crisis that I'm having right now, but you can say, hi, my family comes from a history of mental health issues, and this is how it has affected me. And it gives students a way to connect to each other because everybody's had some experience with mental health issues that I think makes more powerful bonds between students. And I think the bonds are one solution to the mental health crisis that is going on these days.
I think Dr. Lanterman, when he started the symposium, did something very powerful, and that's just the acknowledgement of the spaces that we occupy, which is aligned with what you're saying, and the idea that becoming conscious of that at all times. What are the spaces that we occupy, and how inclusive are we? Inviting. So when we get back into the classrooms, we're a part of that classroom. It's like inviting someone into your home. I'm sure we're all taught when someone comes to visit, you offer them water or something to eat. You ask if they're okay. But as you're visiting, you're also conscientious of being in that person's home, right? And so it's a basic human concept of inclusiveness, and inviting people to be part of that space. And I think part of that challenge as we ask that question is that we're operating in the context of these professions, you know, of teaching how to be good educators or anthropologists, etc. And that tends to develop a silo effect that, you know, that we're the experts. You know, that's I think something we have to wrestle with as professors and teachers in the field, that, you know, we want to teach the content, but as we're doing that, how do we challenge these traditional systems that have created this normalizing process, you know, for people in terms of what it traditionally should be, versus now that we are acknowledging diversity and inclusion in the classrooms, how do we change that up? You know, how do we integrate new things, new ideas, you know, and rebuild? I think that's, and then that's a tough to do as a teacher, as you know.
Yeah, I think bringing it up, like you know, we can get caught up in teaching and just think, you know, get real cerebral and just having this intellectualized approach to learning, when really our emotions are part of it, right? And just engaging that with the conversation and acknowledging that that's part of the learning process, right? If we get overly anxious, we're not going to learn as well, right? If we get overly sad or depressed, we're not going to learn as well. And so that needs to be just part of the rubric that we include, and also having a flexible schedule in our syllabus, and also with the conversation and the discussion. What does everybody else think? I want to hear what you guys think about that. How do we make mental health concerns? Because everybody in here has had an emotion, right? Had a feeling, happy, sad. You have thoughts and you have behaviors. Great. So we all have mental health concerns, right? And it ebbs and flows depending on how we're doing, but every one of us has a mental health concern. And so I think just taking some of that stigma away, and it's like, oh, counseling's only for people that, you know, are broken or need to be fixed. Like, no, I personally, I'm a licensed psychologist and I go see a counselor. And so this is part of what I do to say, you know what, we can destigmatize that. We can just put it out there like, you know what, I want to be better, right? And so I will go see a therapist because maybe I'm stuck on something, or I'm, you know, thinking about something. So just putting it out there and you know, I mean, again, as a licensed psychologist, I go see someone. So all of us have mental health concerns. So what do you think could be done to bring in that conversation? This is the audience participation part.
Hi, thank you guys all for being here. My name is Molly. I'm a student here, and I also write for the Lumberjack. Right now, there is a wait list for mental health services, and I have talked to many students who have been waiting 3-4 weeks. I've recently tried to connect with people in that department and even above that for that question. So as far as, you know, you were talking about design, and then your question, something needs to be incorporated in the university here specifically. And I know it's all over nationwide, but to alleviate that problem. And I know that last semester there was a fee increase directed towards that. So the question is, why is that still such a substantial issue? And why are we still waitlisting students calling? And to add to that, people aren't calling on their high points. They're calling when they need it.
Yeah,
so I think there might be a lack of understanding.
As the mic gets to Chris, and I'll let him talk to that a little more. I want to start by saying, I think that the youth, as Darryl was talking about earlier, right, have really responded to the idea that help-seeking behavior is a good thing, right? For so long, help-seeking behavior was stigmatized, and we worked to try and overcome that. And I think that we've seen a change in that. So people are more willing to seek help and engage in those behaviors. And we haven't necessarily always been able to keep up. The structures haven't been able to keep up with that change. And that is something that we need to address. How do we do that? If we teach people that help seeking is an appropriate thing to do, how do we have that resource available when people engage in that behavior we want them to engage in? Chris.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's a good question. We do not have a wait list for counseling services. We have openings for group therapy that are open. We still have Tuesdays, Thursdays opening, and we also have just opened up a Friday group therapy. We do not have a wait list for individuals that are in crisis. You can come in and you still have same day services. So if you identify as being in crisis, we will see you that day. And so maybe there's a little bit of miscommunication going on there. And I think, probably speaking to your point too, we've hired 5 new therapists. I think four psychologists and 1 counselor, and we're looking to do 2 more next semester. So we are trying to respond to the increased demand. And also we do have an 87% increase in crisis visits from last year. So the need is just exploding, and we are trying to respond by hiring new staff. And so it's just out there, and we think it's great that individuals are coming and seeking our services, and we're doing our best to respond. But we do not have a wait list for, if you're in crisis, you can come and see us. And we also have group therapy that is currently have lots of open slots. So thank you for that question. It's good.
Hi, I just want to add to that. Part of the reason, so this event happens to be part of the Mental Health Symposium series that was created this year. And the reason that was created was actually out of student demand. Over the last few years, we've heard an increase demand for information about mental health, not just through counseling services, but what else can I do to improve my mental health? And so that's what this series is aiming to do. So there are a number of different kinds of events. So this is one of them, to talk about different ideas around mental health. But there's going to be, we had Evie Garcia, who talked about mental health in the context of Latinx students and people. And we will have an event next month around veterans and their particular mental health concerns. And then we're going to end this semester with Epic Fail event, where people can talk about their failures and normalize that, because we all have them. And then next semester we'll have another slate of events. And that's really, it doesn't answer everything, but we're trying to provide some bigger context to what is mental health, how can we help people, faculty, staff, and students on campus.
Other questions out there? Here I come. I like these nice white aisles done by design.
Hi, my name is Parrish, and this question's kind of hard to phrase. So recently, I think mental health illness has become kind of glamorized. And I've met some people who have made mental illness almost a part of their persona, their almost defining factor. When you ask them any question, they invariably respond with something related to mental illness, and that is the only driving factor. And I've been trying for several months to reach out to one such person, and I've had almost no success. And I'm just wondering if there's any insight you could share on what someone can do to maybe help someone who has made maybe a mental illness the central focus of their life. I know that's kind of a hard question.
I think it's a great question, though.
As an anthropologist, as you know, I think there is no easy answer to that question. It's a complicated ball of knots. But I think for me, it is the sort of the anthropological instinct, which I don't think is a bad one here, is to step away and go, look, we are all in large, complex contexts. It is not just, like if we go back to Sarah, it is not just that she has ADHD. It's that she's a woman, that she's a native, that she's a parent. And I don't know how you tell somebody that you have more than one identity. but I think we all need to recognize in ourselves, at least, that we have more than one identity. And I think goes back to what you guys were saying. It's that some identities are more important sometimes than other times. You know, sometimes I'm just a friend. Sometimes I am somebody from New York. Sometimes I am a white woman who's grown up with certain kinds of privilege that other people don't have. But if I, you know, to sort of reach students, I try to have a couple of different identities, because students won't relate to one identity, but they might relate to something else. You know, I play video games. That can lead to another whole conversation that leads in a different direction than where maybe it starts.
I think your initial instinct, right? I've reached out to this person. I'm interested. I'm getting this sense from them, and I don't understand that or where it's coming from, is an important first practical instinct. So how do I reach out and engage this person? And maybe trying different things, right? Listening, engaging, reaching out, as you described, but also recognizing that you may need to be comfortable with the information that will lead you to a conclusion about why they've chosen this as their primary sort of way to interact with the world may never come, right? You may not ultimately get to know that, but you recognize that's a choice they've made. And the other piece, which also can be really hard, is that in caring about that person and in doing that outreach, they may not respond, but they may, right? And the first step is always that sort of that outreach and that demonstration that you care about them and that you're going to listen, because more often than not, that's the thing that comes through. But if that person doesn't engage you back, you may have to at some point say, I'm going to have to be okay with this. I've done the things I think I can do to continue to make this person comfortable and to give them a resource and be a support and let them know I hear them and I'm there for them. Then the choice becomes theirs about whether or not they're going to take you up on that. And I think sometimes it's really hard to be in that position of not knowing, but following your instinct in terms of what's the right thing to do. Other questions? Don't make me walk all the way to the back of the room. No. All right. Do we have any other questions online, John? Or Eric, come with the mic, Chris.
Okay, thank you. Those are great questions, and I really appreciate the perspectives and the responses of our panelists. There have been some broad questions that I think would be important for us to take away and to think about and to, if we're able to, act on. Questions that started with Jamie's question about what barriers are unnecessary that we might be able to discuss and to raise and to perhaps offer solutions to within the system, within the institution. Tyler's question, very provocative question about how are we thinking about the institutional structure and the inherent oppressiveness of the kinds of policies that maybe we have here at the institution, and how might we leave and think about ways to deconstruct those to possibly change them. And to Dr. Wood's question about how do we take this and use it to inform the building of community in our own sphere of influence, our own practice if we're a faculty, or in our own organizations if we're part of an organization. And while I would like for us to begin that conversation, we certainly don't have enough time to unpack that in this moment today. But please take those questions, take those concepts that we've shared, and add into it your own experience, your own understandings that maybe come from different perspectives, and engage in dialogue if you can with your friends, with your students, with your colleagues about how do we take what we heard today and the questions that have been posed and perhaps look at opportunities to make some change, to engage in action around these ideas. I would like one last time to thank our panelists and for all of you for being here in this, speaking of design, this wonderfully designed space, accessible, universally designed space that we're in, and the ways in which it may have either contributed to or perhaps created barriers to our participation. I hope it was more contributory than not. But thank you all, and thank you, Daryl, Chris, Jamie, and Leela. And thank you, John, for facilitating our recording of this event. John, I'm going to ask you, we're recording it, where might we find it down the road? Okay, so possibly on the Institute for Human Development's YouTube channel, and some other possible venues that we might hear about later. But it would be another opportunity for you to look back on it and think further, and perhaps share it with those folks who were not able to be here, either online or in person.
And
So,
thank you, Chris, for hosting this panel.
Thanks. This is the first event in the Diversity Symposium series for this year. Dr. Wood is going to help us create more events and Blaze. And it is also one, as Lauren mentioned, in a series of mental health symposia this year. And it is the first event in our Disability Heritage Month events for this month. And I hope you're seeing those posters out and about on the screens in person. If you have any questions about upcoming events, you can reach out to me, to Jamie, about particularly Disability Heritage Month or the Mental Health Symposia. So thank you again, and yes. Oh, sure. While I have the floor, absolutely. Tomorrow, in fact, we have the NAU for All and CDAD Accessibility Scavenger Hunt, which will be from 11:30 to 1:30, meeting at the Louis statue on the east side of the University Union, where we have an opportunity to go out and explore the design features of areas of North Campus, including the new Kit Recital Hall, which I'm very excited to be participating in, and then have a follow-up conversation about those design features, and to have a conversation with people who have various disabilities about their experience in the designed world, and there will be food. So join us for that. I'm going to try to remember all of these off the top of my head. Next Wednesday, I believe, is the sitting volleyball tournament, which will be from 5:30 to 10 in the South Gym. Is that right? Create a team and come along and experience. This is the 6th annual twice a year event. It's a lot of fun, and hopefully you can come along and either join an ad hoc team or create your own team to come and play sitting volleyball. It is a tournament, so you can win prizes, and there's food there too, and a big trophy. On the 23rd is the faculty panel, which is a conversation with various faculty from around campus about the ways they include disability in their curriculum. This is open not just to faculty, Students are encouraged to attend as well. And that will be 3:45 to 5 in the liberal arts building. That information is on the poster. On the 30th, on the 24th is Matthew Wangeman's talk on everything you wanted to know about disability but were afraid to ask. And that is also a semi-annual event. Matthew always garners a broad crowd because he's so dynamic. And Matthew, where would that be?
IMQ.
In the IMQ lounge from 4 to 6. Will there be food there? No food. All right. All right. Sorry, no food there. And then on the 30th, we have our closing event, which is the Black Panthers, the Butterfly Brigade, and the United Farm Workers' role in the disability rights movement and the longest sit-in of a federal building ever by in 1977.
Yes.
77. This is a talk that will be in Kit Recital Hall, given by Paul Grossman, who was a former chief attorney for the Office of Civil Rights and whose office was in that very building. And it's a discussion on the critical mass that it takes to create some change and the intersectionality of the various marginalized groups in the 70s and how they supported each other to make some significant changes to move the federal government to propagate the regulations for the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act that had been in place for 4 years before regulations were even created.
Now, how's that for a pop quiz?
Yeah.
Chris did not know he was going to need to do that.
So, and then Lauren already mentioned the other mental health symposia events for this semester. So please try to join us for some or all of those events down the road. And certainly looking forward to seeing you on the chilly day tomorrow to walk around North Campus and have a great conversation about design, positive and opportunities for improvement. Thank you.